Okay, first we're going to review what we did last week, and then we will move from that into chapters 2 and 3, which are literature review and the methodology chapter. Okay, then let's go over what we talked about last week. There are 3 parts to basically almost any piece of writing that we do. What are the 3?
Introduction and body.
Yes.
And conclusion.
Okay, we have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. And I'll write that on the board for you. The body and the conclusion. Okay. And when it comes to building a thesis, we're probably going to have about 5 or 6 chapters depending on how we do it, but we talked about 5 last week. What were the 5?
The introduction.
The first chapter is the introductory chapter, the introduction.
And the next one is a literature review.
2 is the literature review.
And then experiment and methodologies.
Well, the methodology, or the methodology and experiment. The 4th chapter,
Results and analysis.
results and analysis. And
Conclusion.
conclusions. Or conclusions and and areas of further research, something like that, right? Okay, sometimes when you're doing the experiment, sometimes a question comes up or 2 questions come up that are sort of off the main path of what you're supposed to be focusing on, and you think they're worthy of study later, you mention them down here somewhere. Okay, and like I said last week, we can paraphrase that very simply as tell us what you are going to do it, tell us what you did. Okay? Tell us what you're going to do it, tell us what you did. All right? Today we're going to get into chapters 2 and 3. We'll start with chapter 2, talk about the lit review, and then we'll get into the methodology once we get past chapter 2. Okay. Now, we remember from last week that for outlining purposes, we have 2 general rules, right? All right. Rule 1, what was rule 1 from last week?
If you have 1.
That's rule 2.
If you have A,
If you have A,
you must have B.
you must have B. And 2, if you have 1,
You must have 2.
you must have 2. Okay, good. All right. So, we know from last week, from looking at the introduction, that we're going to have at least an A and a B. All right, and so we got an A and a B. Might have a C, might have a D. All right. Now what I want to ask you is, what is a literature review? What is it? What's the purpose of it?
To introduce the background information.
All right, that's one of the functions. All right. All right, you said to introduce
Background information.
introduce background information. Okay, and what do you mean by background information? What do you mean by that?
Like the past researches related to the area.
All right, yeah. Let me paraphrase what you said. What other people have done. okay, that's connected to your research question or to your research. Okay, what other people have already done? What others have already done? Why do we want to look at what others have already done?
Because those may help the thesis.
Okay, it could help you. All right, one, it will help you, okay? It'll help you with your thesis, it'll help you understand the questions, it'll help you understand the research, it'll help you understand what others have done. But what else? What else? Okay. What happens if you don't do the background research?
Readers can't follow the content.
All right, perhaps. But if you don't look and see what other people have done, how can you know if anyone has done the same research that you're trying to do, right? It prevents you, or it's supposed to prevent you from reinventing the wheel. Okay, what do we mean by that? All right, it's kind of like, wow, I've got this great idea. All right, I want to study X. You do all this preparation, you do all this research, you find your result, and then you find out, wow, someone comes to your lecture and listens, and that's already been done. And not only has that already been done, it's already been done a dozen times. All right? So you're not contributing anything new. The background sort of prevents you from doing that, okay, doing the background reading. All right? The more you read about your subject, the more you become an expert about that subject, right? Because you start to understand the different directions the researchers are coming from. You start to understand what is acceptable practice in that area. You start to understand what the problems are in that area, the criticisms of the research and the type of research that you're hoping to do. And the more information you have, the better your research is going to become, right? It's basic common sense. So it prevents you from reinventing the wheel, from doing something somebody's already done, or many people have already done. And it helps you to narrow down your topic, it helps you to focus your topic, and it helps you, if you understand it well enough, it can help you find that niche that someone else has not already done. Okay. So that's why a literature review is so important. Okay, it tells us, the reader, what it is that you're basing your arguments on, how you're formulating your methodology, how you are planning the project, whose research you looked at, whose research you didn't look at, okay, in formulating your research question. Okay, so now we know the literature review is made up of journal articles, books, online sources, databases, collections, archives, anything you can imagine that is relevant to the research question that you have. What goes in there? Okay. What might we consider our A and our B to be? Okay. We know we're going to have many, many sources, right? Okay. Less so in a thesis than in a dissertation, but you're still going to have a number of sources that you have to cite, okay, that you're going to either quote directly in your research or that come through secondary sources, and you are going to have to find a way to organize this information. So, what might our A and a B be? Think about that for a second, okay? And let me give you a little hint, okay? But first, let me tell you that depending on the subject matter that you're into, this might vary a little bit, okay? And here's the hint. If you are focused on a single subject, okay? In other words, your research question or your research problem is very, very directly involved in a single subject. Okay? In other words, it's not interdisciplinary. This is going to look different than if you're doing, for example, an interdisciplinary study. Okay, and that's your hint. So what do you think?
Well, the first one must be the introduction of the chapter.
All right, it could be. All right, so we'll put that up there for now. We'll put some kind of introduction. Okay, if you want. What else?
Explanation of the terminologies.
Okay, explanation of your terminology could come here, it could come in your methodology chapter. It depends on how you sort of put that argument together. Okay. It's possible. We'll put it up here for now. So we don't forget it. Okay. What else? Okay, let's imagine for a moment that you're doing something interdisciplinary, okay? Remember I told you before that I worked on brand names, right? And brand names in linguistics were not covered very well, okay? There are very few studies of brand names in linguistics. You could probably count them on two hands, all right, when I started doing the research. So, if the subject that you're studying in your discipline is not very well covered, you have two options. Either you can say, well, there's very little there, so we don't have a very long literature review. Or you can look at what?
Past researches?
Well, what if there's very little past research available? Okay. How about looking at other disciplines? Other subjects, okay? In my case, brand names was my subject matter, okay? I was looking at brand names, okay? Brand names, shohyome in Japanese, and the area where I was studying was linguistics, okay? But there was very little there in linguistics, okay? So what I did was I went to other areas. Where are brand names big? Well, one area is business. So start looking at how business treats it. Okay, business is definitely not going to treat it the same way linguistics treats it, okay? Because business, they want to protect the name as much as possible, for example. Also look at law, okay? Brand names are regulated, they're registered, all right? So we got to look at the laws regarding brand names, okay? We can also look at marketing. Okay? Look at marketing, because people have to market brand names. And that's going to have some impact on how brand names are used. All right? So, just because I didn't find much here, doesn't mean that there's not a lot available that you can start to move, to take things from here, from here, from here. And by creating a good dissertation, it's going to have an impact on linguistics as well. Okay? By pushing this in to that area. All right? So, what I'm suggesting to you is that, okay, in the case where there's not much available from your area, look at other areas. Okay, look at other subjects and see what you can find there. Okay, and in that case, it makes your literature review a little bit easier to deal with. Okay, but let's say that you have a traditional one. Let's start first with that you have a traditional one, and you're doing something in applied linguistics or language teaching side of things, and you really don't have to look at other stuff. There's plenty of information available within language teaching for you. Okay? In that case, then let's try it your way and see what happens. Okay? We start off with some kind of introduction. Okay? leads us in, leads us into the literature review. Then what?
Introducing the field of, for example, linguistics.
Okay, what kind of research are you planning on doing? Tell me again.
About humor.
Yes, you're going to be doing humor. Okay, and you're going to do humor in language learning.
Yes.
All right, so let's put this up here. I'll take yours as the example. Humor and language learning. Okay. Have you started collecting background information? Have you started reading?
Just a little, yeah.
Okay. Is there a lot available or not a lot available?
Nah.
There's not a lot available, right? There are journals, for example, that specialize in humor. Okay, and they're not directly related to language teaching. They're often found in English or in literary studies or in some other place. That may be a source of information for you. That tells me you're probably going to do some kind of interdisciplinary focus. Okay, you're going to have to borrow things from different areas to be able to use them, right? Okay, so if that's the case, all right, you've got humor and language learning that you're going to have to sort of get together here. All right, and we know that there's tons of stuff about second language acquisition, how people learn, okay? You may find some aspects of humor over here, but you may find that the majority of studies on humor are probably from, other areas, probably from English or from literature or from something, okay? So you may find yourself working a lot over in these other areas, trying to read enough information to put together how you're going to study this, how you're going to measure it if you're going to do an experiment. Okay? So, and of course your supervisor will have quite a say in the kinds of things that you're reading for that. But, okay, if you're doing an interdisciplinary one, I want to set that aside for a moment, and I just want to focus on if you're doing something in, for example, let's take a subject like history or something where you're really not going beyond your subject area. Okay. All right, you have the introduction here. We know the introduction is not going to be very long, probably. What do we want to include in there?
An introduction?
Yeah. You don't need a hook anymore. You've done the hook at the beginning of the book. So what do we want to put in your introduction?
So just tell how you're going to organize the literature review.
Okay, and how would you organize your literature review?
First of all, I'm going to introduce the humor.
Okay, all right, so you're focusing on yours now, right? Okay, let's just take a general one where you're not moving between disciplines, right? What would we do with this?
So introduce the field.
All right, look at, well, let's put it over here, previous studies. Of X, whatever X is that you're doing, okay? Right. That's one way of doing it. All right. And obviously you could put this in as your B if you wanted to look at it as your previous studies. You're going to have a real short, if you do this though, you're going to have a real short A and a fairly long B. All right. So I'd recommend if you do that, then you do some kind of breaking down into main points you're focusing on. Maybe focusing on the methods, okay, that other people have used to study humor or to study whatever the subject is. You could, what else? Look at traditional research problems in that area. You could look at, there's a number of things you could look at for this, okay? And if you did that, and if you're only working in one subject, then maybe you could get away with only an A and a B. Okay? But remember, you're dealing with a chapter that, you know, who knows how long that chapter is going to be. Could be 15 pages, could be 20 pages, could be 30 pages, depending on how much information you have to deal with, how many sources you're citing, how many researchers, how many methods, how many things you're looking at. Okay? So, all right. This is a simple way of doing it. And if you're just looking at previous studies of X, previous important, maybe. These may or may not be directly related to your research. All right? But you're sort of using this section to say, see, I read it, I know it. All right? These are the main pieces of research on this subject. They may or may not be relevant to my research. I'm going to assume right now that they're not relevant, okay, that they're not directly associated to your research, only in the other than the fact that they were at the time the top research in the area. Okay, so let's put a C in here. Okay, if these are not particularly relevant, other than that they deal with the same subject and that they're major studies on the subject, then what's this going to be? Let me put it up here to help you. Okay. We'll put important, but not directly connected to your research. Okay. If we did that, okay. For example, let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, that I'm studying some theory of grammar, okay? Either a theory of grammar that I'm proposing or a theory of grammar that someone else has proposed. It's kind of hard to propose a theory of grammar, any theory of grammar, without going back to the history and without mentioning Chomsky, okay? And Chomsky may not be directly related to your research, but you sort of have to mention it, okay? And that goes in right here, okay? When I was a doctoral student, there were at least three competing theories within my PhD program, okay? There was a theory, there was what? At the time there was a minimalist program, there was a lexicase, a Stan Starosta, and there was something called assignment grammar with a professor named Greg Lee. Okay, you know, it's hard to argue a grammatical theory, for example, without going back to Chomsky. At some point, you have to mention it in the review and stuff. Okay, so if these are important but not directly connected to the research, then you need to have a section that's going to talk about the stuff that really truly inspired your research, okay? The research that's directly related. It's either directly related because you're studying the same subject matter, or it may be directly related because you're borrowing a part of their methodology. Maybe they ran a test and you want to run the same kind of test in some kind of replication study or something. So there's lots of reasons for doing that. And by getting this section out of the way, you can focus on, okay, now let me turn, you know, now I've paid homage to the scholars who sort of developed the field. Now let me move to the stuff that's directly related to what I'm doing, and I want to focus on these researchers. You understand? It's clear? Okay, so. That's one way of doing it. Okay. So saying, for example, and this of course is if you're staying in one discipline, okay? I'm doing history, I'm doing typical history, okay, history studies. Or I'm doing a scientific experiment that's based completely in chemistry or biology or physics, but I'm not moving beyond that, okay? That's where we get, you can have your small introduction if you want, but you've got previous important studies that aren't directly related to your stuff, but you just mention it because you're developing an understanding in the readers of what has come before you. And then when you get down here, saying, now let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to the stuff that has inspired my work and that helped me form these research questions, or that I can take parts of and I can use in my own research. And that would make a very interesting thing, I think. Okay? So, is this clear so far?
Yep.
All right. And then, if you don't want to forget, then, you know, down at the bottom of C or something, you have your connectors. All right? So, in your introduction, if we look at it this way, in your introduction, you're going to have a couple of key points that you want to remember. You're going to sort of outline what's coming up, what's in this chapter. Okay. You need a 2. What would your 2 be here? Could be some kind of connecting sentences. Could somehow connect it to B. Okay. So for right now, we'll just put it as a connector. Okay. Then we get down to previous important studies of X. Okay, and this is where, when you get into your 1, your 2, and everything, these are going to be the studies that you want to talk about. Okay, so what I'm recommending to you is 2 things. I'm going to recommend 2 things to you. Okay? The first thing is, as you read stuff, keep track of it. Okay? As you read stuff, and as you're highlighting information, and as you're finding, wow, this, you know, this quote explains what I want to talk about. Okay? Do 2 things, okay? As you're building your outline, start finding where it's going to go in your outline, okay? As you're reading these things, start building it up, okay? So, and start putting them in order, okay? That's one of the important things. A lot of people have trouble with the literature review because they have trouble with ordering articles and stuff, okay? And the second thing is, as you read each of these, start putting the citations in your references, in your bibliography at the back of the book, okay? Why? Because one of the problems graduate students have is they read so many things. They're reading so many articles, so many papers, and they've got lecture notes, and they've got all kinds of things that are going to go into this, right? And what happens is, if they wait until they're actually writing their thesis, sometimes they forget to put the citation at the back of the book, okay? I remember I did this, even I did this in my doctoral dissertation. I missed one of the citations, and somebody found it in my dissertation defense. I thought I had them all covered, but I missed one somewhere. Okay, it does happen. But as you're reading stuff, if you say, okay, I read this, I know I'm going to have to cite this in my thesis, so this is the part I'm going to use. Let me put the citation right now into the back of the references, and let me set that aside for now. When I come back to writing, it's already in the references. You can check it off. You can keep some kind of comments or notes that are going to tell you that you've covered it, so that it's there, so that the thing in the thesis matches the thing in the bibliography later, and that's going to be important. So you'll do that at this level. For the previous studies, you'll do it for the research directly connected. You'll have all of those major studies that you want to talk about. And you need to spend a lot of time ordering these, okay? Because you need to know, how am I going to talk about this? How am I going to go from this author to this author to this author in a fluid manner, in a logical manner, so it takes us from idea to idea efficiently, okay? And it's easy to mess this stuff up. It's easy to get them in the wrong order. It's easy to get them, you know, and that order is going to depend on the nature of your research, okay? So, now, we've talked about this in terms of how we would focus on it if it's, for example, in a single discipline, okay? Do something like this. Can I erase this? Okay. Now let's look at one that's interdisciplinary, one where we're borrowing, like we talked about, like for humor and language learning, or like I did for brand names. Let's look at that. Okay. Now, okay, literature review. Now, let's say, for example, that we're doing it with multiple disciplines. You're doing humor, so probably some of it's going to come from English, some of it's going to come from, could come from anthropology, it could come from some other place. Some of it is going to come from second language acquisition. All right. So we know that we're going to have to cover research in at least a couple of areas, right? Okay. So we'll put our A and our B. Don't worry about the introduction stuff right now, because always you can put the introduction in as A1. All right. It ain't that big. It ain't that important of a thing to have it as a separate section. Okay. Unless you've really got a lot to say in the introduction, like you might have in methodology, for example, or some place like that. Okay, so I put the C in for right now. It doesn't necessarily mean we'll have one. We know we got at least an A and a B, and we know that in your subject you're going to have to focus on research within your discipline and research coming in from outside, right? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So, probably the first thing that you want to do is cover major studies. Okay. So, major studies of humor. Okay. All right. Now that's one way of doing it. Or you could do it as major studies of humor in SLA, if there's enough information there to support that, right? Okay. If you did that, then what would B be? I'm going to take my shoes off again. What would B be, right?
So now the major studies for SLA?
All right, well, you've got major studies of humor. Let's hold off on the major studies outside of humor right now. Let's just focus on humor. Okay. Then what might the B be if we're going to do it, if we know that we have more than one subject that we have to consider? Then what? Here's the key. That's in SLA, okay? And we know that, as you said earlier, there's not that much available, right? Okay, compared to a lot of other subjects. So if that's the case, and I don't know if it is or not because it's not my subject area, but if there's not a lot available in SLA, then you're going to need another section outside of SLA, right? So, for example, I'm going to assume, and I'm not sure I'm correct or not, but I'm going to assume that there's a lot of studies of humor in English, okay, in traditional English departments, which are literary or other things, right? Okay, so we'll look at important studies of humor outside of SLA. Outside of SLA, then you might want to do as your one, for example, English. Your two could be, I don't know, wherever they study humor at. Okay, could be anthropology, could be psychology, could be anywhere where they're doing those kinds of studies. All right, so you might want to look at it that way. That's possible. All right. So we got major studies of humor in second language acquisition, important studies of humor outside of second language acquisition. All right, if we cover those, you've got those two there, then what? Now what would your, if you wanted to have a C, what would your C be?
Other than connectors?
Yeah, forget about the connectors and stuff. Okay. Here's your key again. Humor, humor. You've covered the humor stuff. But often what you'll find is if there's not a methodology, or there's not if there's not an experiment that's been done the way that you want it, you may find that somebody's done an experiment on something different that has some aspect that you can use in your own research. Right? Okay? So why not do something like other important studies? In other words, other important studies that are not humor related, but I'm going to borrow from them and I'm going to apply them to humor. All right? This is a very common thing in doing research. It's looking at how someone else conducted an experiment in a different area and saying, I wonder if I can use that in my own research. And often that's what you'll find, is that, this is going to work. So I would say you might want to have a section on other relevant studies. Not directly related to humor, but stuff that you can use. Okay? And that would be a useful section to have. Now, as I said, if you have a lot of terminology, like you mentioned terminology earlier, if you have a lot of terminology, you have to find a place to put that. Okay? Now, there are good arguments for putting it in the introduction. There are good arguments for putting it in the methodology, because you're about to conduct the experiment to help people understand how you're doing things. Or you could argue that you want to put it in here, okay, as it's introduced. You could simply cover it as it's introduced, as the research studies come up. For example, Clark and Jackson, 1984, talked about humor in terms of A, B, and C, and those are each vocabulary terms. You could introduce them within each of those sections as they come along. You don't really need a separate section for it. All right? You could do it. Some people do it. Some people have a separate section if they only have a limited number of vocabulary that they have to explain. Okay? Some people prefer to just deal with the vocabulary as they come up. Okay? And say there's a few important terms we've got to cover, and I will cover the others in time as we get to them. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay, good. All right, so does this make sense? There's another way to do it. I've shown you two ways to do the literature review. Okay? This is not to say that these are the best ways. These are not to say that these are the right ways. It's going to depend on a lot of factors. It's going to depend on you as a researcher. It's going to depend on the kind of research you're doing. It's going to depend on your supervisor, who's going to have some say in it as they look over your outline. And it's going to, kind of depend on the kind of experiment that you're going to do. All right? But I've shown you two different ones. And one that's focused on, if you're working in a single subject area, and one that's more interdisciplinary. Okay? When I did my doctoral dissertation, I think I covered important studies on brand names. I think I covered a section of the role of brand names in linguistics or something like that, and then I focused on important studies of brand names outside of linguistics. So I threw all the other fields together, I think is how I did it. Can't remember. Okay, we're good? Yep. Good. Okay, so that takes us through the lit review. Now, as I said, we're going to focus on the lit review, and I want to take you briefly through, well, not briefly, I want to take you through the methodology section as well. Okay, just to give you an idea. All right, maybe we'll do a little brainstorming on how we might do that with humor. Okay. So, we just covered the introduction and lit review. Okay. And this is the tell us what you're going to do. Now we get to 3, which is do it. And we've already decided that we're going to look at this in terms of methodology and experiment. Some people like to separate these. If you want to do a 6-chapter thing and your experiment has a lot of information that you need to present, then you might have an extra chapter. You might have a full chapter on methodology, especially if you're proposing some kind of new methodology for something. Okay? As I think I told you last week, occasionally chapters 3 and 4 get a little messy because there's lots of different ways to organize these. If you're stressing the importance of the methodology, if you're stressing the importance of the experiment, where you want to put the results at, if you want to present the results in the experiment chapter, or whether you want to save the results for that, and if you want just this to be just analysis, there's lots of ways of doing this, depending on how you put it together. All right, so we know we've got methodology and experiment. It says, do it. Okay. We know we're going to have at least an A and a B. Wow, you could just go methodology, experiment, A and B, right? It's possible, and people have done it, and it's not altogether terrible to do something like that. You know, depends how you do it, right? But there is a lot of stuff that you need to consider, and there's a lot of stuff that you have to find a place for in this section. Okay? So let's take first things first. Methodology. What do we mean by this? If you're doing an experiment, what does it mean we're doing the methodology section here? What is it that we're explaining? What is it we're explaining?
How are we going to organize the experiment?
Okay. Maybe how we're going to organize it. Tell me more.
How do you investigate it?
All right, how we're going to investigate this. If we've got hypotheses, if we've got, you know, are you going to do this through a survey? Are you going to do this through participant observation? Are you going to conduct interviews? What are you going to do for your experiment, and how are you going to do it? Okay, all of that stuff. If you're going to do this as methodology and experiment, all that stuff has to find its way into here somewhere, right? And there's quite a bit of things that you need to consider. All right, you're going to study humor. How are you going to? I mean, what kind of experiment are you planning on doing? Do you know yet?
No.
Okay. Are you going to do something like discourse analysis, conversation analysis,
Yeah.
something like that? Okay. You're going to have to explain that somewhere in here. Okay, what I'm going to do. All right. So let's look at this and make a list. Okay. What method or methods am I going to use to conduct the experiment or collect the research? Okay. You need to consider that. What else do you need to consider? Okay. How about how you're going to construct the experiment? Okay. In other words, how are you going to collect your data? Okay. So let's call this construction for now. Okay. We'll put data down here. Okay. How you're going to construct your experiment. For example, let's imagine that you're doing a survey. Let's imagine for right now you're doing a survey. How many people are going to be involved in the survey? How many, what are the demographics of the survey? Okay, how many people, what age groups, how many males, how many females, how many elderly people, how many young people? Okay, all of that you need to consider, and you need to explain it somewhere in here. Okay, and if you're doing a survey, then you're going to have to explain it probably right here. Okay, in the construction. Okay, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to do it on, for example, a lot of students do it on campus. They do some kind of on-campus data collection. All right. One of the advantages of that is you can narrow the age band, for example, focusing on college students and things like that. And there are reasons for doing things like that. But, so they're going to do 5 males, 5 females, for example, or 10 males and 10 females, all within this age group, all collected on this day, at this time, in this place, and all of that you need to explain somewhere in here. Okay? All right? If you do it that way, then your data collection is going to be in here somewhere. How are you going to collect the data? Well, I'm going to collect it this way. I'm going to collect it on a survey form. The survey is going to have 20 questions and things like that. Okay? So it could be, data collection could be part of construction, or it could be a separate thing here. But one of the things you need to consider is, how are you going to limit that activity? Okay. What's the word that we use for putting up a wall here and putting up a wall here on something? What do you say in Japanese? Something like gente or something. What is it in English?
Limitation?
Okay, could be a limitation, but limitations in research sort of have a different meaning sometimes. Okay, it means sort of the shortcomings of the research. Okay, and that's not what I mean here. What I mean here is the limits that we place on, for example, data collection, or who's going to be involved in the experiment. Okay, who's going to be involved? Is it just going to be you as a researcher, or are you going to have you and a couple of assistants helping you? How many people are going to be involved? Why that number? Okay. How many males, how many females? Why that? Okay. What do we call that? We call it constraints. How are you going to constrain the research? Okay. And why are you putting the constraint here? Okay. Why did you decide on college students? Is it convenient? Okay. Is it efficient? Okay. Why not a wider selection of people from the general public? What are the advantages of doing that? What are the advantages of doing that? Every decision you make in formulating your research problem, in how you're going to collect the data and how you're going to construct the experiment, you need to consider the constraints on those. And you need at least a section somewhere that's explaining the constraints. What are the constraints in your research? Why are you limiting it here? One of the most common questions that comes up is on a survey, for example, why did you select the number 50 for 50 people to survey? Why did you select 36? Was that all that was available? Okay. Was that the number of people on the island where you're doing this at? Okay. There's a lot of reasons for limiting the number of people that you survey. Okay. But that's going to come in your constraint section. Somewhere you need to mention the constraints of the research. Okay. So, all right. Right now, we got what methods am I going to use to conduct the experiment or to collect the data? It should be data. Okay. How are we going to construct the experiment? Okay. The data collection methodology. Okay. For example, once I collect the data, then I'm going to run these tests on the data. Okay. There's all kinds of tests you can do. You can do chi-square tests or t-tests or any of that kind of statistical stuff, or validity tests or any of those. And what constraints are there on the research? Okay. And also by doing constraints on the research, you're saying what is involved in my research question and what I'm setting aside for now. I'm only going to focus on this problem in the research. Okay? I'm not going to look at this bigger issue right now. And you know, if you have things like that, that is also what may lead to question and areas of further research later. Okay? If I'm limiting it here, that means there's something else over here I may want to consider. But I can't consider it for the purposes of this piece of research right now. Okay? So, yeah. So if we say that this is the methodology, then basically we can just shift this over if we want to. Okay. And of course that's a tab in, so it's going to be right there. All right, how do we construct it? Data collection constraints. Okay, how am I constraining the research? How am I constraining the experiment? That's quite a bit of information right there. Right now, you could probably sit and write a couple pages about that if you knew what your experiment was. Okay, and how you're going to conduct the experiment. So now, if we have this, you got everything? Can I erase this? Yeah. Okay. All right. We know that A's, if we want to do A as a methodology, we can do it this way. Then we know that we talked about A already. A is a methodology. B will be the actual experiment. Okay. Right? So, all right, if you're doing discourse analysis, for example, you already explained how you're going to collect the data. All right. Now you'll talk about the actual analysis, the actual experiment, and how you examine the amount of data you had. So you have this much data. You need to look at it. You need to start isolating whatever it is you're looking at, cues of humor or whatever it is. And you need to explain that out here. All right. If you're going to do in chapter 4, if you're going to do results and analysis, this is going to have to remain somewhat objective, okay? Because the subjective stuff is going to come in the analysis, right? So you're going to kind of want to remain kind of objective here, probably, or neutral. So when I did my research, when I actually conducted my experiment, I had collected data for a corpus. I created a corpus of brand names. Okay. And much of the work that I did was involved in the creation of the corpus. How did I create the corpus? And actually it took me 3 tries to create the corpus, and there were reasons for that. And I had to explain out those reasons. Why did it take me 3 tries to create the corpus? Okay. What happened when I ran the tests? Okay. I had in my research 4 hypotheses that I was testing. Okay. So because I have 4 hypotheses in my testing, in my methodology section, I talked about the methods that I was going to use to test H1, H2, H3, and H4. Hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, hypothesis 3, hypothesis 4. And then in the experiment, I actually talked about what happened when I ran the test. Okay, in addition to problems in the creation of the corpus and stuff. That's what happened here. I didn't analyze, I just said this is what happened. Okay. If you have hypotheses that you're testing, if you're doing hypothesis testing, somewhere in your methodology you're going to talk about the connections between which method are you going to use to test these things. It's probably going to come up here as well. In mine I had 1, 2, 3, 4 were 4 hypotheses. I took a look, and this is what happened for each one. In my case, after running it, this one was successful, this one was successful. 1, 2, and 4 were good. 3 needed some changes. And I'll talk about that in the next section. Something like that is, I think, what I did. Okay. And again, it's going to change depending on what you're doing, the kind of research that you're doing. Okay. Are you running tests of stuff? Are you doing what's called armchair research? In other words, you're not actually conducting an experiment, you're explaining something. Okay? You're going back, you're hitting the archives, you found new information, you're presenting new information. It's not really an experiment. Okay? So, if you have an experiment and you're testing it, you might want to test it this way. Like I said, that's H1, H2, H3, H4. And focus on each of these and the results of each of these when they were tested or when they were put through your test. Okay? That's one way to do it. If you're just doing a survey, for example, then you'll want to talk about what happened when you conducted the survey. How many people did you approach? How many people turned you down? Okay? Are the questions valid? Okay? Did one question cause problems for people and you had to eliminate that question? There's all kinds of stuff that you can talk about in here. And each time you do an experiment, it's going to be somewhat different. Okay? Sometimes the experiment might go flawlessly. There might be no problem with it. Sometimes you might have problems. The first time you tried to do it, some event happened, and there were not enough people there. Couldn't collect the data. It rained. Nobody wanted to participate. You know, all of this information is interesting and may have some impact on what you're learning from this stuff. Okay, so it's particularly the number of people who turned you down is kind of an interesting number. I think. All right. So in its simplest form, if we do it this way, that's one way of doing it. Okay. So, any questions about this? All right. And basically, like I said, this is the do it. And there's a lot of things you need to think about and a lot of things you need to consider and not forget to include. When you conducted the experiment, if you had problems, you should somewhere in here mention the problems that you had. Okay? That's not to say that you did something wrong, although that's entirely possible, but it's so that if there's a problem, you expose it first. Okay? For example, one of your hypotheses didn't work. Something happened. You had to change it, you had to do something to it. Tell us about it somewhere in here. Okay? And why do we want to do that? Why would we want to expose a fault that we made in the research? Why might we want to do that? Okay. I told you before, when I created my corpus in my research, I had to recreate the corpus a couple of times because I made a mistake in the planning. The reason why you want to expose that is because you're doing the thesis as a demonstration of your scholarly ability, right? The people that are going to be reading it are going to probably know your subject matter at least as well as you do, especially your supervisor, okay? If you don't expose the problem in your research, if you know there's a problem in your research and you don't expose it, that problem is probably going to come up at your thesis defense. Your supervisor will probably find it. Okay? But if you've already said, this is a problem, this is how I dealt with the problem, end of story, you've already addressed the issue. So technically, it's more difficult for your supervisor to ask you a question about that problem. Okay? You eliminate that, gotcha. I found a mistake in your research. You eliminate that possibility, okay? By being upfront and saying, there was a problem in the research and I made a mistake here, but this is how I dealt with it, okay? you sort of solve that problem. Okay, so that's why we want to do that. By you pointing out the problem, you're taking away the ammunition from people who might ask you questions at your thesis defense. Okay? So, any questions about the literature review or the methodology chapter? Okay, are we good? Good. So let me erase that. So, in this second class, what I've talked about today is literature review, how to organize your literature review, why we do a literature review. I've also talked about the methodology chapter, which is basically how you're conducting your experiment, what methods you're using to do that. I've given you a couple different ways of creating the literature chapter, depending on whether you're basing it on a single subject or whether you're doing some kind of interdisciplinary research. And I've taken you through at least one way to look at the methodology and experiment chapter, okay? Talking about all of the things that we need to consider, including the constraints and the construction and all of the other minutia of conducting an experiment. Okay, so when we come back next time, we're going to look at results and analysis and the conclusions and areas of further research. And that'll take us through the basic style of doing a thesis outline. Okay. Of course, there's other stuff we can consider too: the front matter, the bibliography, and we'll have to do that in a couple of weeks. All right. But for today, we looked at the literature review